Hello, everyone, and welcome to, I believe, the fifth High Council meeting for Songs of the Aeons. And today we're going to discuss population and how we would like to implement population long-term in Songs of the Aeons and how it interacts with the various systems that we've created so far. And so we have with us a number of our High Council patrons as well as someone from our inner circle, and they'll be asking questions after I give a brief intro of what we're planning to do with population, as well as what has inspired the system that we are settling on. And so first, I wanted to actually talk about how population is usually represented in other games and how it deviates from actual historical reality and how we want to change that in Songs of the Aeons. And so for anyone who's like a grand strategy fan, who's a fan of like Civilization series or Europa Universalis series or Total War series, typically population tends to just kind of be scattered evenly around the world for the most part, and that significantly deviates from what you see in history, where you have pockets of highly dense population that tends to be the power centers of civilization, right? So if we pop over to Google Earth, you, for instance, for most of history, had more people just living in the Yangtze Delta than you did have people living in the entire Asian steppe, right? Or you had more people living just in Mesopotamia than people living in Western Europe. And that had significant consequences in the way that civilizations rose and projected their power. And it also creates an interesting dynamic where you have, concentrations of settled people who are producing lots of agricultural goods and able to sustain a large population. But then in the hinterlands, you had, pastoral people and nomads and who had significantly lower population densities, but were very mobile and were able to pose a threat to the high population centers. And so we want to be able to try and capture that phenomenon in Songs of the Aeons, where you have certain hotspots for population due to sort of a conspiracy of favorable conditions, from climate to soil to geology and hydrogeology, things of that nature. And to a certain extent, anyone who's been following the project knows that we've already, to some extent, done that, right? And so you can see, right, we have areas of mineral richness which tend to have better agriculture, able to sustain larger populations. We have river valleys that give you better nutrients and more silts and better soil moisture, which gives you better agricultural yields. And so in Songs of the Aeons, what you can expect, this is especially interesting up here, you'll be able to expect that certain areas will be able to sustain larger amounts of population, and that'll tend to be kind of where you have the center of certain powerful civilizations. Not to say that you can't create impressive civilizations elsewhere in little pockets, but those will tend to be like your Chinas and your Indias and your Mesopotamias and Egypts, right? So yeah, that's the first thing that we wanted to talk about. In Songs of the Aeons, population won't just be sprinkled around like in a lot of other strategy games. But also we'll be talking about how we plan to represent population as well. And so Calandial is currently working on the population system now. And ideally what we're going to do is, you can't really see it right now very well, but we'll have provinces that are composed of various tiles, and we'll have population units, pops, that exist in a tile, which represent kind of an aggregation of certain types of people with certain skill sets and things like that. We had sort of mulled over the notion of representing every single person in the world, and having some basic statistics about them, but we kind of there were certain memory challenges associated with that, and so it's kind of something we.
You were trying to go full Dwarf Fortress, right?
Right, but of course the issue there is the trade-off is if you want to represent every single person, it's perfectly possible, but you have to constrain the number of people that exist in the world because it just becomes too much, either too big of a memory imprint, or it just the performance tanks because you're trying to simulate all these people. So it's like, okay, if we want to represent every person that lives in the world, then you end up, only with 10 million people where there should be like 200 million. But anyway, Calandial, if you want to take it away from here to add anything.
Yeah, just to finish on that note with characters and population represented by single people. Yeah, I don't think it's gonna be possible. Like, we talked about it a lot, but I finished testing it a week or so ago. I think I mentioned it on Discord when I was talking with SotE, but it didn't really work out. So for now, we're gonna go with pops like we have in Victoria, but with more detail. Because in games like Victoria, you don't really have all that much depth about population. You have only a single number to represent everyone. So in some of the eons, we would split the population into multiple groups, such as children, adults, elders, and yeah.
Right, so you can have different types of demographic phenomenon happening at a given time, right? So disease can come through and kill the old or the young, or a war that takes a lot of the prime age men and things like that. So you can basically have a period of time where a society can be suffering because it doesn't have a normal age distribution, which is then amplified depending on the race. If you're just goblins and a bunch of prime age men die or something, it's not necessarily a big thing. In a couple of years they're replaced. But if you're elves or something like that, then you could literally have a 100-year period where there's this gap in in a society's demographic history.
That's extremely interesting. Can I just ask a question? When I do like a 50-50 system where you have, I've been reading a couple of studies that they were like talking about patents and inventions and stuff like that, and it's extremely top heavy. So the vast majority of people produce no inventions, no patents, but there are 1% or even less than that produce the vast majority of the patents and inventions. So can you do something like that where you have pops for the vast majority of people, but for very interesting, very exceptional individuals, you have them a more detailed representation of them?
Yeah. Well, Yeah. Go ahead, Cal.
Yeah, we can, and in fact, if nothing stops us from going with this route, we will indeed have so-called characters to represent nobility and important individuals that will do your research and doing academia. If you've played CK2, it would be something similar to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of almost like the idea is, when a certain pop is doing well, when a certain pop with a whole bunch of people in it are doing well, we can basically promote one of those people out of the pop to become like a real person, right? If they're important, and then they can kind of exist in the world. We'd even kind of discussed the idea of kind of having tiers of kind of relevant people. The least relevant people are down in the pops, and then you kind of have very, very minor characters where you have fairly simplistic AI operating with them, and they have fairly simplistic ambitions, and then you can you have more granularity the higher up you go, and the fewer people occupy those higher ranks, right? You could almost have a situation where you have a specific, depending on the affluence of a given pop, you can be promoting more people into a higher rank of character.
Maybe that could feed into some kind of caste system or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that goes a little further than probably where we've made concrete plans, but yeah, possibly. Or feudalistic system, of course. Typical and solitarian, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I was wondering, will a pop be a specific unit? For example, one pop is 100 people, so a population of 900 is 9 pops. Or will pops be more vague, like in Stellaris?
A pop will, I'm not really sure how to answer this, but a pop will have a number of people associated with it, However, it won't be like in Stellaris and Sith, where it's the same for every population unit. So, for example, you could have a pop of bigger artisans with 77 adults and 13 children. And as monthly things roll, it would grow or shrink depending on the in-game situation.
Yeah, and from a memory standpoint, we want to avoid a situation where we would, like, the whole point of pops is kind of to be more efficient, from a computationally efficient standpoint. So if we end up with a situation where we're generating, a whole bunch of pops with 1 or 2 or 10 people, then they're not really doing their job. So they're, it's gonna. My suspicion it's almost gonna be a bit of a continuum where there's a certain range you would expect a certain number of people to fit in. But it's like, let's say you have a little city up in the mountains here on this little plateau, and you're gonna have way more farmers than you would necessarily have like artisans or something like that. So you can imagine the situation where you'd have, the artisan pop would be smaller but would kind of be more meaningful, and then you'd have pops of farmers that are probably more substantive and more abundant. Does that sound about right, Cal?
Yeah.
Typical. We're calling on you. Dance, monkey, dance. Are you maybe saying something and we're not hearing you? You usually have a lot to say, so I don't want to leave you out. A lot of valuable things to say. No, we can't.
Nope.
I cannot hear you now.
We did before, though.
Yeah, that's odd.
Now.
Yay! Yeah, we got you.
Oh yeah, it turns out my USB hub died, apparently.
Okay.
So it's like a Victoria 2 type system.
But better.
Yeah. Basically, that's more detailed because Victoria is just one number for the entire population, and we'll have gender distribution and age distribution within the hub.
And perhaps more important than even that, like in Victoria, and this is the thing that bothered me about Victoria, you didn't have very many factors acting on those pops, right? And so it was like, the government discovers a new technology, and so those pops now grow 1% faster, and it's like, it was a very simplistic, situation, whereas our pops, they will be, right, they'll have like nutrition, right, which will influence how well they're able to work, how many babies they're having, their average lifespan, right, all kinds of geopolitical influences or climactic influences or whatever can influence their livelihood, which influences, all the things I just talked about, right?
So how does the spread of technology work with pops?
Cal, do you want to talk?
Honestly, I couldn't understand the question.
I
The last part.
was wondering how the spread of technology works with pops.
Yeah, so in most video games, technology is defined on the country level. So like in civilization research sites, and when they get them, they get instantly teleported to every single corner of the empire. So I think in some of the EOs would want to move away from it, and instead tie population to provinces and population. So you can have a situation where you destroy a country, and the refugees from that country spread technology with them to other areas.
Yeah, and you want really, like, you have domestic, you have sort of domestic discoveries within a given society, but I think just as important is the expansion of technology between cultures. And so you'd expect, like, someone from a pop which is of the same culture of another pop which is on this island, like, you would expect that because you have those commonalities between the pop, right, the technology should spread as well more quickly, depending on what kind of regular interactions they have, right? Typically through commerce or conquest or things like that.
So technologies are spread on like a per pop basis rather than a per empire basis.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Like for instance, Genghis Khan can come in and burn down the Great Library of Baghdad, and then all the scholars are dead.
Exactly. That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah. So even historically, technology has been lost and reinvented multiple times. So it's not. This works.
Absolutely, and you know, we, especially in songs, like, we want technology to be lost. We want societies to be able to go backward, and so it'll create interesting situations too, where you'll see like a lot of the world decline into disrepair, you know, from infighting or invasions, and then possibly have, you know, a rump state survive with some of that technology up in the mountains or something like that. You know, create a lot of really interesting situations. So yeah, good question. Go ahead.
So the most important question, I think, when it comes to population and pops in general, and you touched on this a couple of times, is production. So how exactly is that going to look? You also mentioned earlier about pastoralists and like herding nomads, how their power struggle ended up shaping history. So most famously with the Mongol conquest, or in general the Eurasian steppe, the Yamnaya culture.
And Turkey, and Timur, and and Genghis Khan, like over and over again.
Yes, exactly, and the entire Arabian conquest. I mean, they were essentially herders and merchants. They weren't farmers at all.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you can kind of see, and this is one of the things that, like, and I'll always talk about this dynamic because it's something that you can see just by looking at the Songs of the Aeons map, right? And once we get biomes and stuff like that fully implemented, then you'll really be able to see the effect. But you can see where, right, you have areas with rivers where you're going to have exceptional agriculture and sort of greenish plateaus where you'd have nice agriculture. But then you see, right, these drier areas out here, probably grasslands or scrublands, where a pop literally can't reliably make a living off of farming in such a way that they can permanently colonize these types of areas, but a herder can, because they can use more land to produce less and still make a living, you know, by moving their herds around and things like that. And so you can even see in a situation like this where you would have like your cities and your agricultural lands kind of clustered along rivers and in areas like this, and then out in the hinterlands you'd have you'd have herders and stuff like that. And you can, you know, if the cities aren't able to the settled people can't kind of exert some kind of control over the hinterland pastoral people, or they can't come to some kind of arrangement like the Byzantines and Khazars did, then you have that kind of friction that you see over and over again in history, where the herders are kind of like, well, we're making a living out here, but our living kind of sucks, and so we have a high incentive to raid and take things or extort tribute from the settled people, and that sort of sets the stage for that interesting kind of friction.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we have a small request from the stream. Could you remind us volume a little bit?
Oh, remind us what? About what?
Its volume. Could you turn it up? Because people are having trouble hearing him.
Uh-oh. Hearing me or hearing...
Mindless.
Oh, mindless? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Say something, mindless.
Yeah. Hey.
Everyone hear him? Yeah. Everyone hear him better? Okay, good. All right, thanks. Thanks for bringing that up.
Hey, so as I said in the pre-stream, I wasn't really following the development all that much. Do we have fantasy animals yet?
We had just started working on regular animals, but the good thing is we're generalizing. We're going to generalize animal behavior, and so the great thing is we'll be able to add in fantasy animals, and they'll basically they'll follow the typical behaviors that we've defined for them based on sort of whatever crazy fantasy parameters we give those animals. And so it's just a matter of sort of, you know, the behavioral algorithms picking up on whatever variables we give the fantasy animals. So
yeah.
Are animals also stored as pops?
Yes.
Yes.
I think they might even show an example of that, because I think we have them on provinces.
Yeah, so right now all we have is bison, and we're not really doing anything right now. But yeah, what we're going to do is basically, you know, we're going to seed the the world with the various animals. Some animals are going to be very sedentary and they'll just be shy and live in a particular place. Other animals will move around substantially depending on the opportunity. And so you'll have, in some cases, large herding animals roaming around in grasslands. And ideally what you'd have then is, societies that would then pick up on their behavior and hunt them or, follow the herds or things like that.
So are pops stored per province or per hex?
Per province.
Yep, they're on provinces.
So like how does that work when like the provinces overlap multiple kinds of terrain? Well, I can example if the river's here, like there's part of the province that is in the river and part that's in the hinterland.
Right. It's funny. Yeah, Calandiel and I were talking about this just a few days ago where right now provinces are randomly generated, but we're going to come up with algorithms that will basically generate provinces and have them be disposed to biomes, geographic barriers, and things of that nature. So you're much more likely to see a province kind of in here and then running along a river, that kind of thing. And so you'll have a little bit of overlap, right? And when we run our animal, when we give animals a turn to do stuff, they will, from a province level, evaluate the province, evaluate the environment. If it's like a grass eater, then it will target the grass tiles, right? And then the effect of those animals will be on specifically the grass-disposed tiles, right? So you can see here this is mainly a grassland, right? And so they'll go for the grasses. The shrubs might be eaten a little bit just as kind of an afterthought. And so what's interesting is the animals will influence the kind of species turnover and vegetation types you have in the tile as well, as they target the things they prefer to eat. That will be an important part in maintaining grasslands, is actually having stuff out there.
Nature will also work with economy systems, so if you cut forests, you may cause ecological disasters.
Yeah, we're
but
actually...
also,
Go ahead.
But also cutting forests is very important for creating farmland, right?
So it's interesting because forests, they have multiple effects, right? So a forest captures water, prevents it from getting to the ocean, and then pumps it back into the atmosphere. And so forests are good for rainfall patterns for your farmland. But then also when forests grow in a particular area, they build up a very large layer of organic matter, which crops crave. Organic matter, it's what crops crave. And so that's why when you chop down a bunch of trees and you till the land, you have this virgin soil effect where it's good for a whole bunch of years before you exhaust the organics, right?
Yeah, that's interesting, but the situation in Western Europe and I think in India and in China as well was mostly forested, right? Mm-hmm. So covered in woodland, and you can't farm that. So what ended up happening, I think, was all of that got cut down, and now we're left with mostly grassland, farmland, and stuff like that, except in the mountainous areas.
Right, where you can't farm anyway, right? And so it's kind of you can have an effect where you chop down all the trees and you're basically causing long-term degradation. This was especially true in the Mediterranean when it was a lot greener, and it's suspected that that the long-term change in weather patterns was also related to the fact that all of the trees were pretty much removed. Basically, in the Levant, you once had these very, very large, dense juniper forests that used to keep a lot of the rainfall in the area, and now you don't have anywhere near as many trees, and it's had negative consequences naturally on the climate.
Something occurred to me. I think perhaps rivers should be their own provinces instead of the borders between provinces. So that way, the control of the river itself would be separate. That would be good for beavers.
Yeah, it's funny because you're touching on something that's a technical problem that has been troubling me. Because, like you said, there can be two approaches, right? You can have borders along rivers, but then you have a weird situation where it's like, all right, well, which side of the border does a river land on? Or you can kind of have the province like this, where it's kind of evenly split, and then you kind of okay, this province controls the river, so to speak, and then you have this very clear division of who controls what headwaters and stuff like that. But and it also makes the pop question simpler too, because then like, okay, the pops here are going to be floodplain farmers, right? Or irrigation farmers as opposed to rain-fed farmers, right? So they're going to more likely use a certain type of technology, have certain cultural traditions that relate well to irrigation farming. And so, yeah, constructing provinces in that fashion probably is the best way to do it, even though it's not the perfect way to do it. Let's see. Any more questions?
Sure, I have some. I came with a list, as last time.
Good.
So if a province is conquered, how will the population dynamics be between the pops of the conquerors and the pops of the conquered? The cultures could mix, or the conquerors could adopt the culture of the people they conquer, or vice versa?
Well, that's the thing. So culture is going to be something that is on... So remember how we had sort of the tiered system with you have pops, where you kind of the dumping ground for all the lower class people. Then you have your mid-tier pops, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those tiers can have a culture, right? So you can have a situation like where you have like the Parthians who come in and annex an area, and sort of like the upper class is one culture. And then they kind of just rule over, all of the lower class people who are another culture. And depending on which culture kind of has more soft power behind it or whatever, can kind of end up influencing either upward or downward. So like in China, right, the Mongols invaded, all of the upper class ended up being the Mongols in the Yun dynasty. But then like Chinese culture was just more powerful than Mongolian culture, and so they all just ended up kind of becoming Chinese after a while. That's a significant oversimplification, but the Mongols imposed much less of their culture on those that they ruled over than the reverse, right? And so you could get that same effect by kind of having culture on each population entity, be it a pop with a whole bunch of people in it at the bottom versus distinct characters who have their own culture as well, if that makes sense. And Cal, if you have anything to add.
I don't really know.
All right.
I'm loving those glacial lakes. Show us some more. Show us some more.
I've been wanting to generate more of those glacial lakes too, by the way. But yeah, there's these guys which are the result of isostatic compression from the last ice age. Boom. And since the entire southern hemisphere is land, this ice age went like totally wild. But yeah, that basically isostatically compressed all the areas down here and created a bunch of glacial lakes. But I'd like to create more like little kettle lakes, like these little guys down here in the tundra. Yeah. You can even see some of the moraine effects here from the last ice age. Some of the terminal moraines. So no name. You got anything else for us? Otherwise, we're just going to let Solitarian talk constantly.
Okay. So how do pops gain technologies?
We haven't planned that in all that much detail, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
basically,
Go ahead.
You would have a bunch of requirements on every technology. So, for example, unlike in civilization, you wouldn't be able to research iron working without iron.
Yeah, I mean, really, the way I see it is when you give, like, really the way that you end up with sort of like crucibles of technology is you would have kind of a pop which is specializing in a particular kind of lifestyle. I mean, so there's two types of technologies that you can kind of imagine. There's sort of like the more settled people type of technologies where it's like, oh, so we have this urban area that is super dense and you have a whole lot of, surpluses in food, so you can have lots of people who are concentrated, being able to focus on specific types of behavior. So you end up with concrete, the invention of concrete or something like that, because they need to build stuff, blah, blah, blah. Then you have other technologies like, the composite bow for steppe people, right? And they're kind of, maybe they don't have as many intellectuals and engineers sitting around, but they do very intensively focus on a given lifestyle. And so, right, you kind of have two modes there where if the ground is fertile for discovery for a given population in a specific domain, you would see those advancements begin to occur, right? And not just that, but there needs to also be a large enough critical mass of like a community who would be using that technology in order to kind of build the sort of habitual infrastructure to adopt it, right? So I'm sure lots of people came up with great inventions in antiquities, but it never got adopted widely, or it was never used enough to be refined, by the community that used it, and so it just kind of fell by the wayside, right? And so that's kind of the way that I would imagine technologies would be coming about. And so if you were the player, you would be wanting to create the underlying conditions that would allow for that kind of success. And if you're in a more advanced society at some point as a monarch, it can be like, oh, okay, so you decide that your monarch is going to be sort of an intellectual emperor or something like that, and get directly involved with technological development. But that would be sort of an exception, in my opinion. Instead, you'd be wanting to create prosperity of the type that leads to innovation.
So it's sort of like Ymir, in that your pops just kind of randomly stumble upon technologies if certain conditions are met. Okay.
Yeah, and you can set probably create laws and parameters to to either that might either stunt it or encourage it.
But perhaps without Ymir's hard-coded and hidden secret conditions for the technologies.
Yeah.
Because in Ymir specifically, there is this paradox where, for the longest time, people didn't know how to research agriculture because the developer didn't tell them. So they were stuck playing in Stone Age without agriculture for hours on end, being unable to advance.
Yeah, what would be nice is to have situations in game where someone comes up with something fascinating. It creates a buzz, and and it comes to the court's attention or something like that, and you can take some action to kind of hold up this invention as something special, without necessarily knowing it could just become a dud or something like that. But it would be nice to create gameplay opportunities, where it's not just like you're watching some expansion of technology completely out of your control, like to have some actual proactive gameplay elements.
Or more likely, it just ends up declared a heresy or something.
Yeah, right. Or but that's another thing. Like, will you be the ruler that stands up and causes civil disorder, for the sake of something you think is going to improve people's lives? Like, that would be a good example of a gameplay mechanic, right? Where you have to put on your strategy cap and kind of rub your chin, like, all right, is it worth causing this kind of social turmoil with these key power brokers in my society who want it stunted? Is it worth doing this right now, given all the other challenges I'm facing, right? And that would be the kind of thing that we'd want to go for.
Yeah, that would be like something like a major restoration type thing in Victoria, right?
True. Yeah.
So a very underdeveloped society, not necessarily, but with lots of potential, meets a very developed society, and so there's friction.
Right. All right. Anyone got anything else?
Why, yes. Yes, I do.
I knew you would. Go ahead.
I was wondering how the movement of pops will be. Will they just disappear from one province and then reappear in a neighboring one in the next month? Or is it calculated day by day or tile by tile?
Right.
We'll have to see.
Yeah, that's an unsatisfactory.
It's a really computationally intensive problem. It's like, obviously, the ideal scenario would be to have pops exist on hexes and move them day by day. But I don't think it's possible. So I think what will end up is some kind of compromise where certain kinds of movements are done hex by hex, whereas other types of movements are done through quote-unquote teleportation. Because if you want to move a small number of people between two provinces that are neighboring each other, I think you could just move them as variables without forming a new entity on the map. But if you have like a huge movement of people with entire tribes migrating across the Rhine or something, then I think you'd want them simulated in more detail.
Yeah, and it's sort of like we may be this question may be made a lot simpler by the fact that and I think you're kind of solitarian. I think you're referring kind of like to the whole demographic shift kind of question, as opposed to just like I don't know, a merchant going into town to get something type of thing. Like, you know, before the modern era, like, you really just didn't have lots of people moving around. You know, you didn't have people like me saying, hey, should I move from Florida to North Carolina for a new job or something? Like, it just wasn't really something. The vast majority of people who were born in a given place died in a given place, right? And so when you do end up having migrations and things like that, permanent migrations, right, you would expect it almost to happen almost on a pop level, right? You'd have a whole pop pick up and then move to a new place. And so if you imagine like, okay, this place was going through a lot of turmoil, a pop here was like, fuck it, we're going over here, then you could kind of represent that as like as something that's literally moving like an army to another location and it having influence along the way. So they pass through here, they don't have enough food, so they steal a bunch of shit, and then the local powers are like, no, you're not going to steal our shit. And then they're like, oh, well, we'll fight you for it, and then you have to defuse the situation, you know. That can actually be kind of the source of some interesting gameplay mechanics, right? And so on that level, right, whole pops moving, that would be something that we would want to represent, right? Whereas just like, you know, a family for whatever reason decides to move to another pop because they promote to the big city or something, you know, that's not something that we really be. It would just kind of be teleportation, right? Okay, a person from here promotes to this pop over here, poof.
You know, you can solve that problem with the same idea as with the character thing, where you just, instead of, you know, promoting someone permanently to being a very important figure, you just have them promoted temporarily. So they're like on a journey, they're going down, you know, they're traveling down a river or something, or performing anything interesting, really, like a merchant traveling with some interesting wares or something. You just temporarily promote them because it's not really they who are interesting, but their behavior at the moment.
It's true.
You can give them better simulation or something.
It's true, but we also wouldn't necessarily expect someone who is lower class to suddenly become relevant enough to go do something and then become non-relevant later, you know? It's kind of a question of how much do we focus on. So let's say we have a pop with 100 people in it. How much do we care about one person in there doing sort of complex things, moving around in complex ways in the world when people in that position never really did that anyway? Does that kind of make sense? Unless they join an army or something and then march off, but then they become a part of another larger unit and their behavior is tracked on that level anyway, right? If that kind of makes sense. It's kind of like once they do promote, then you would expect them to stay there unless something smacks them down. And
yeah. Makes sense.
Okay. But yeah, these are all kind of, it's like there's the mechanics that you would theoretically want, you know, for things like population, and then we're always in a situation of trying to reconcile it with what's possible, right? And that's we're kind of brushing up against that now, getting an inside look at it. Typical, you've been quiet for a while. You got anything else that's not necessarily related to technology?
No, not in particular. So like pops are tracked as part of armies. So like if the army moves, the pop moves with it.
Yeah, well, it's so that's tricky because especially when you consider the way a lot of non-professional armies operated, like if you're dealing with like a situation where you have semi-trained militiamen or stuff like that, you would almost like, you can imagine that you would have sort of like the army as an object, so to speak, which then keeps a list of how many pops are contributing to it and how many individuals from each pop has. So you could, what I'm trying to say, you could have an army, right, and it says, okay, so we have regiment with X number of people from this pop, regiment with X number of people from this pop, and then that way you'd kind of be able to track, okay, so when someone dies from this regiment, it has a downstream effect of someone not returning back to the pop that they came from, right?
Okay, so not like Victoria, to where the soldiers are like a separate pop, and and the number of soldiers you can recruit determined by that soldier.
It would be probably eventually for things like professional armies, right? Where you're permanently a soldier, you're going to stay permanently a soldier for 20 years until you retire, and then we give you a little piece of farmland or something, right? Like Roman legionary type stuff. But just with a lot of the pre-modern. With some of the pre-modern armies, you probably wouldn't make them a pop explicitly because they need to be able to return home, right? But if it was a professional army, then yeah, you'd probably make a pop out of it, and then you'd keep some essential demographic figures about it, so that when and if they ever disband and become an elderly guy living somewhere, they can kind of return to the rough vicinity of where they came from, if they so choose. Cal, do you have anything to add there?
No, not in particular.
Yeah, Ken in the stream says some species might be highly migratory. And I think it's important to recognize, Ken, the difference between like communities moving around and migrating a lot and just sort of individuals in a species kind of just wafting around on the wind. Yeah. I mean, maybe, in like sort of the Dungeons and Dragons type universe stuff, you do have some races that just kind of end up scattered around. I guess, I don't know, gnomes might be a little bit that way. I don't know, but that's tricky. Even then, like, you would expect them to form around in little communities, right? Kind of like in the real world with little Judaic enclaves in urban centers and stuff like that. Like, the odds of just someone totally being off on their own without having any former any other former family support there, I think is pretty unlikely. Yeah. All right, Solitarian, we're going to rely on you again. Bust out your list of questions.
Okay, no problem. How much information about pops will the player be able to see? Obviously, you don't want a ledger like in the Paradox games where you can see absolutely everything. But also, there weren't really statistics in antiquity, but rulers still had an idea of who they were ruling.
Sure, yeah, you could ask around or something like that and get around, hey, who lives over there? And you'd have a native from over there who could kind of give you a rough idea, even if they couldn't say, like, hey, there's 1,213 people living there, and among them there's 213 infants. Yeah, so that's a good question. This is kind of an issue where making the player see less can actually be more work than just showing them what's there, right?
Yeah. If I may add some practical point of view, right now we don't really have a playable game, so I think for the time being we would have to show the player everything, just because we already have to make that UI for the World Explorer and World Builders. So this way we can save some time until we have all the game systems, and then we can think about hiding information from the player.
You could hide information just by rounding it. Like with the Armies and Dominions 5 or the
but that's still the code that we need to consider in multiple contexts, right? Because you have to remember that even though you can round it for the player in game, you wouldn't want to round it for the player who's just observing the game and spectating what happens.
I was thinking like there could be like different technologies or magic that could affect it. Like this is a great example of like how like Saruman and his Palantir can
definitely.
information about the Empire. Then I don't know. Then
we will definitely want something along those lines eventually. I think for the time being, for like the next update, we'll have to focus on showing the player everything, just so that the update doesn't take forever to finish.
Oh yeah, I think it makes sense like for like the alpha and beta builds to like have more information there. That way, it's easier to do like bug fixing and stuff on it.
Yeah.
Like if you're the developer like play testing something, it's good to know like do I have 5,000 people there or do I have 10,000 and like what effects does that have and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it would be kind of nice. You know, you would think that before census is right, like a ruler, you can kind of imagine them up in their castle looking out the window and kind of seeing what their, the castle town around them looked like, and they'd tour their realms and kind of be able to just look around and tell by the condition of the people and their disposition and the greenness of the fields to be able to tell like how rich or populous or how well things were going, and it would be cool to kind of have that kind of concept exist in game, but yeah, it takes more work to conceal it than to just probably show it, because you like everyone said, you need to have that kind of stuff displayed anyway for developers and playtesters to know that things are working properly. But I think especially with songs, in the same way that you can look around on this world map and kind of tell what's where and get a general understanding of the fertility or desolation of an area, you could probably do the same thing in game and create meaningful mechanics in that fashion. Just not something that we would do right away.
Yeah, of course, because you're obviously doing the simulation with perfect information, and so any deviation from that's going to be additional work, like trying to deliver imperfect information.
Right.
You said about a ruler, traveling the land or being, I don't know, gathering information from, village elders or whatever. But imagine a situation with, like the Chinese emperor in the Forbidden City, where all the information that he has of the outside world is through advisors or something.
Well, yeah. In that case too, it's like literal. That's most advanced society on Earth, pretty much, and so that's where you would actually get real numbers, right? And in that case, I would imagine like if you have an army of bureaucrats who can take censuses, like I don't see why in that situation you couldn't just be like, okay, player, here's all the numbers, right?
Eventually, you could have like census laws for the player to set that determine how much information he's collecting from his bureaucrats.
Right. Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah, what would be really cool though? Imagine like an imperfect map being formed in real time, like as people are exploring and sort of drawing maps and whatnot. So it's based on like a cartoonish view or an imperfect view of the real map, but it has a bunch of fog of war and like mystical sea creatures out, or like I don't know, a city of gold over there.
Yeah, that would
people are imagining.
Right, that would basically be when Songs of the Aeons is making lots of money and we can hire a guy to...
Okay, yeah. Right.
That's a pretty advanced... Because then you've got a situation where, all right, well, whose perspective do you see that map from, right? So let's say you're like Greek culture or something, and it's like your perception of what it would look like would be different than what some Gallic person would perceive it as, So you get into these... So if you jump from one civilization to another, you civ swap or something, like they couldn't see the same map, and it gets pretty complex to then sort of stylize each individual map. Although I guess you could basically have each culture could have different fog of war, right? And then you could have some procedural algorithm kind of generate and adapt a stylized map. But yeah, that would be oh my god, Songs of the Aeons has like $1 billion. You don't know what to fucking do with it. Let's hire some guy to, to go ahead and work on it. So a nice fantasy, but not anything we'd want to promise anytime soon.
One day.
One day. Yep.
sure. 20 years into the future, that's the safe bet, you know. That way you know it's never gonna happen.
Yeah, right. Make promises that you won't be alive to keep, right? All right.
Amanes in the stream chat had an interesting suggestion. What if you just had the real number, like in the paradox ledgers, but you just randomly added or subtracted some large number as a margin of error based on how efficient your bureaucracy is?
You could be. You'd kind of have to. It's weird. You could. It's probably doable, right? So, yeah, depending on the efficiency / corruption of your bureaucracy, the magnitude of your bureaucracy, you can kind of have like, all right, so this is the real number. We're going to give it a standard deviation, and then we're going to stick a pin in a certain spot, and then have it kind of wiggle and wobble around, right, based on a number of factors. Like, that's a possibility, but then you kind of, then you wonder, too, to what extent, so I guess to go back, the point of having imperfect information is you would want the player to invest in getting more information because it would improve their ability to make decisions, right? That's why, it's the same reason why the census was done in the real life, right? In the real world, is you want more information so you can make more informed decisions. I'm curious, like, with that approach, to what extent are you able to make better decisions if you're 1 or 2% off on your number, right? It's one of those, is it worth spending the time to program it in, right? And maybe it is, but I'm not sure if it is or not. But that's the kind of question I'm asking. But it's an interesting idea. It may not be difficult to implement. You just have to kind of...
It's always something we can get back to later, because it's mostly an issue with UI. So it wouldn't be too difficult to adapt it, I think.
Right. And you can almost imagine a situation where, depending on how good your information is, you have UI components that become activated, right? Where you can dig deeper. And it's just, if you're just a nomadic tribe with wandering around with a government structure that revolves around a couple of dudes in a hut making decisions, like, you have a different UI components that allow you different levels of access to the world. And so you might, you'd have perfect access to your little society. You're only 500 people, so you know exactly what's there. But then you go clicking out into other places, and it's just like, it's like dragons on the map, like Mindus mentioned. Locking some parts of the UI behind the statistical right? You have to bribe a bureaucrat every time you want to see how many chickens are in your province, right? Let me think. Is there any other?
So one question. Formula One qualification is coming up. So I was thinking, how important is entertainment and games and tournaments? How important are they going to be?
Good question. It's cool because it's one of those things that it's one of those things that government actually did get very aggressively involved in, from everything from like, hey, I'm throwing a big feast in order to create an environment where I can get to know all of my subordinates better and make them more loyal to me, to like, hey, we're going to build a giant hippodrome and sports are literally going to be entrenched in our politics, right? Like in Constantinople, you had like sports teams that were literally like part of your political party and could be used as like thuggish soldiers when you needed them, right? It's like, it's the other extreme end, right? But and it was important, right, in creating social cohesion, things of that nature, and related to things like sports, right? You have the arts too, right, which is somewhat similar, where you'd have some patron, right, paying for something that that sort of helped with the self-actualization of the soul or something of your population.
Yeah, I think it also touches on a slightly broader subject, because what we're really talking about is what is pops and their needs, in the economic sense.
True.
Because in games like Victoria or Civilization, you have those basic needs like food or clothing, but you don't really have spiritual needs or entertainment needs represented in any capacity.
Well, you know, and you have to dig deeper too and ask the question, okay, well, what the hell is entertainment for? Like, okay, so it can have a health impact, right? It can de-stress people, but then it also has every excuse you have to get people together is an opportunity for them to exchange ideas, to invent things, to make connections in commerce and things of that nature. And so you can almost imagine, to get back to Mindus's original question about like a sporting event, like, okay, let's say you have this big sporting event, it's the only excuse to ever get 100,000 people in your city together in one place, right? It makes them all feel like they're part of the same group, and so, you know, so let's say it has a positive effect on their willingness to revolt. It de-stresses them, which increases fertility slightly, improves lifespan slightly. You know, it also gives them a little bit of a martial advantage, because they're either watching a bunch of gladiators duke it out, or they're, you know, watching horsemanship in among the charioteers. You can almost imagine how something like that would produce these broad, sometimes even intangible, positive consequences. You know,
It also could have a huge impact on culture.
that too. That's a really great point. That could be, because the lamer reason I always came up with, okay, so a ruler makes a statue or something that reminds everyone of the blah blah blah. But like, I think, a sporting event could help solidify, you know, the cultural identity. It would not just solidify the cultural identity. It would sort of define the culture, but then it would also give the culture soft power too, right? So
Because like, on one hand, you have bigger hyperdromes fighting with hoplites, and on the other you would have elves reciting poetry in the forest.
right, yeah.
And that would be completely different.
But you could also
Completely
imagine,
different unit types when you raise your limbs or something.
right? But you could also imagine too, like, you know, foreign invader invades your city with your high culture and its magnificent. It's magnificent arenas, and your conquerors are like, wow, this is some pretty awesome stuff. And that's sort of how you culturally convert somebody, right? I mean, you look at the soft power that the United States has with its movie theater, you know, with its movie industries and its ability to kind of infuse American culture into all these different places. Like, same thing I think existed to some extent in the pre-modern, right? Especially in urban centers, for sure. So that would be another component to entertainment, mass entertainment. Right? Beavers probably play water polo. That should be an unspoken fact to everybody. Good question.
One unrelated note, something that occurred to me. Are dead pops trapped separately from living pops? I was thinking like it could be useful for like necromancy and stuff to like have an idea like, oh, there's this many corpses laying around, and there's this many that have been in the ground for this many years.
Yeah, I haven't talked about Fidel yet, but I think it would be really cool if we explicitly tracked burial practices of Canadians as well as dead people, so that we could have different cultures, have different reactions to necromancy and such.
Yeah, that's a great idea, No Name, and that's actually, why did I say No Name? Typical.
I do worry about like over in the long term, like if you're just tracking one dead, like it's been in the ground for like 1,000 years.
Yeah, since you play Dominions, and I could make a comparison. It's like, you know Nazca in Dominions.
Do I know what Dominions?
Nazca, the nation.
Vaguely.
But it would be...
Basically, they have burial practices where they put dead bodies on top of big towers, kind of like Zoroastrians. And because of that, they have a much easier access to dead skeletons, so they can research necromancy more easily.
Yeah, you know, typical name, like, to your point, yeah, it's like... I don't think it would be very difficult at all to track those pops and to maintain... Basically make them a simple version of normal pops, you know, with a few conditions that you want to track. So how well were they buried, right? So kind of in the Songs of the Aeons world, it could be like the reason why you give people good burials is so that when a cosmic event comes by, they can't just burst from their graves, right? if you sanctify the... And you could track that on the pop, right? Yeah, so I think that's something we'll definitely have to implement, I think. That's a good idea.
Yeah, there are also sanitary considerations, because some dead bodies could be infected with diseases or something.
That's true too, right?
Of course, and there's
And so,
sorry, go on.
and so if you have your necromantic religion, which puts dead bodies on display, maybe you get easier research in that magical area. But then Black Death comes around, and suddenly your people aren't burying anyone, and then disease kills much more people.
Yeah, so there's a lot of potential interactions there, I think.
And it's very important. I guess sort of the cultural attitude towards dead bodies and the deceased, the deceased, probably impacts sort of some medical technologies, because famously, a lot of the Renaissance medical practitioners, cut open human bodies recently deceased again. I'm doing the thing. Recently deceased human bodies to figure out what, how they were made up and stuff like that. So it could affect medical technology, and it could also affect. I mean, this is when you're not quite making billions of dollars, but perhaps a couple million. You could maybe. The cadavers are currently being studied, I think, for how they decompose and stuff like that, in order to aid in forensics and similar. So I guess it affects technology, most importantly medical, but perhaps something else.
That can be an interesting kind of gameplay drawback, right? Where it's like, if you have a culture that isn't hyper sanctimonious about dead bodies and making sure that the graves are never disturbed, blah blah blah, then if you're not as sanctimonious about it, then you could sort of get, a buff to certain types of medical technology, right? Or more likely that certain medicinal technologies come about. But then it also means that when the blood moon rises, like, you end up with more necromantic problems or something.
Or you could play and eat your bodies.
Yeah. As a side note, by the way, while we're talking about, Songs of the Aeons and its future and stuff like that, I feel like it's also probably good before this meeting is over that we have a conversation about the direction we're going in, and also the progress that we're making and what's going on with our lives, so that especially like the patrons know exactly what they're paying for, right? And just understand kind of how it fits into our lives. So, before the meeting's over, it would be good to have a conversation in that regards for a full transparency, right? But once we're done with all our pop questions, we can go over those details. Oh wow, there's a fancy goldfish island here. I didn't even notice that.
I was about to say.
it looks. Yeah, it looks like a beta, like a Chinese fighting fish, right?
The dorsal fin is fabulous.
It's got a Here, actually, I gotta go ahead and look that up now. Let's see. And we'll do a side-by-side beta fish for anyone that is unfamiliar.
Solitarian, any more questions?
Yeah, yes. While you're doing that incredibly important fish comparison, I could ask, I was wondering about pops in battles. So in the wiki entries, you noted how dwarves were very sturdy and harpies had thin, bird-like bones, and how will the game track combat prowess of pops so it knows who is fighting whom and which one has the advantage?
Right, so you would imagine, like with our previous army example, right, you create this new pop, right, that exists on army, you siphon off a certain number of people from another pop, and then you keep characteristics about that pop's nature, right? So not only would you have like, these are dwarves, but then you could also have like how healthy they are, If you're basically conscripting a bunch of people from someplace that's on hard times, even the healthy individuals are going to be less capable, and so that would translate into their performance in battle too. And you'd be able to, and then when they return home, like, so let's say you take a healthy person, send them off to war, they're put into their own little pop, that'll end up returning. If the campaign ends up being disastrous and they come back sick and frail, then basically you would factor that new health back into the population they're rejoining too, right? So you can check all that stuff, I think, pretty easily back and forth just by keeping it on the pop, those conditions on the pop that's in the army.
You get bonus points if your troops bring back Black Death from the Armies.
Do we, okay, any more pop questions?
I was wondering how detailed, how elaborate is the history view going to be? Like, are we going to be able to view the history of a province or of, important characters or whatever, or of a nation? I guess nation's probably the wrong name, like, of a state.
Yeah, that's challenging. Because Songs pushes everything to the max as is, so it's like, all right, how much memory do we want for, stuff that's already happened?
The pragmatic approach, I think, would be to delegate this to mods, because a modder could make the game autosave every year or so, and then write some analyzer to display your history. I don't think it's something we would support immediately ourselves.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, because it's funny. You'll play like Civ or Warhammer or something. You'll win the game or you'll lose the game, and then it's like, oh, it shows the history of blah blah blah. But it's like it's tracking such a minuscule number of things. Civ World has a couple thousand tiles versus millions in Songs, so it's like it's way more practical to just store it in one big history file for them because the game's not very big. I imagine for some things you probably could. This is kind of cool here, but you like you said, for like a specific great character or something like that, to be able to procedurally generate a story for them may not be too difficult. But yeah, any non-pop related questions?
That thing about the undead invading the world suddenly reminded me of the old mod I heard for Civilization 2. And the thing about the mod was that there were multiple layers to the world map. There was in addition to your surface world, you had an underground where the goblins lived. And I think possibly the undead, I don't remember. There was an underwater where the merfolk lived, and then there was a sky map where the eagle people lived. I was saying, would it be possible to do something anywhere remotely similar to that, or are we already using too much processing power as is during this?
Well, I imagine what you would do, right, is you could get that effect by having. So if you had one world, it depends on what you're trying to do. So if you want a kind of ethereal plane that maps on top of the world you already have, then it's just a matter of keeping a different variable on a tile, right? And then kind of rendering it to the player in a certain way so that it appears like there's a world above or below your given world.
If it's also a good idea. It's sort of like the plane of mirror on Master of Magic,
right? Right, or even we had discussed the possibility of kind of magic coming from an alternative plane that's layered on top of the world as it exists here, but has completely different topology and kind of magic arises from, magical river is going through here. You can't see it in the real world, but you do see its effects, right?
That's genius. So you can have nexuses of power and people gathered there, even though it's like a desert or even if it's a desert or something, it can give that place a very interesting power, and a reason for people to gather there.
Exactly, right. And we're just spitballing here, but it's just one of the things we kind of contemplated. But it would lend itself really well to kind of have an additional layer of procedural generation where you procedurally generate the magic world on top of this one, and it can be kind of related but not identical, and its features kind of could influence, right, like you say, right? You could see just a crappy desert, in the real world, but in the other world it's a magical forest or something, and so you have kind of, its influence peek through, and you can harness the power and stuff like that.
That's great. Great idea.
I think that also would be important for more practical things, namely tunnels. That'd be something the dwarves and the vermin would do. So if you have an underworld map beneath the real world, then you could have dwarves going under mountains and able to access areas that other races can't.
Well, that's interesting, because, and we kind of thought of this because, right, we have a lot of data pertaining to bedrock, right? And so the extent to which you could get away with that as a dwarf would depend on, the nature of the mountain that you're living in. So it's you could have this alternative so when you're looking at just the surface, right, you can see that these two areas are geographically isolated from one another because they're on opposite sides of this little ridge, right? But then the dwarves theoretically might be able to burrow under it if the bedrock is right. But if you had the situation where the rock type was not favorable, it would also be geographically isolated to dwarves too. They wouldn't be able to get across if it was something that collapsed easily or was too hard to dig through. But if it was, if it was just regular granite like this, then they could, And so dwarves might have a completely different kind of perception of what is geographically isolated and what isn't, because they can kind of dig underneath based on the geology of the area. So yeah, that would be an interesting idea, if that makes sense.
For the longest time, I've been dreaming of making some kind of Arctic-based or glacial-based civilization, because in our world that hasn't really occurred, or it's not even close. You can kind of get away with living near a desert if there's a river there, but all of the rivers are frozen up in the north.
Right.
And so your idea about the magical world really kind of has my brain juices flowing. If there's some kind of nexus over there, then maybe I can make a civilization up in the glaciers.
It's a cool idea, yeah, because you could have a situation where you yeah, you're right. So if you're in the desert, you need something subsidizing your existence, either a spring or a river going through it. But you're right, everything's frozen up north, and so if you had some magical thing that was subsidizing the area, then the people could kind of subsist off of it and use. So, for instance, you could imagine a situation where, so one of the things that constrains plant growth in the tundra or in the Arctic is soil temperature, right? And so even though you do get sun throughout the year, which you can grow stuff with, the soil is so cold that there's no microbiome producing anything that can allow it to survive. But if you have an area up there that is a weak spot to the plane of fire, and it heats the soil and melts the snow, you could literally have a little city there that grows food in the summer with its nice heated fertile soil, right?
Or maybe you just get a monopoly on some magical resource and you buy your food from the local civilization.
That too, right? And then you have Inuits come in with bringing in food so that you can survive. Yeah, but yeah, you could have an Arctic society if the fisheries are robust enough, because there's actually in extreme latitudes you have quite a bit of marine mammals and fish and stuff like that.
Yeah, the Arctic krill, right?
Right, and so so if you in theoretically you could have that kind of situation as well in Songs of the Aeons, especially if you were a race that was specialized for that kind of behavior. Then you could do even better than the Devonians or the Inuit or the Greenland Vikings, right?
That's just so cool, man. I just a bit of a story. I'm sorry. There was a release 2 years ago or something with the most rudimentary stuff. It wasn't even close to this. This looks so much better. But it really sparked my imagination. So I had to become a patron.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's funny because I say this all the time, but when Calandiel and I started this, it's taken us longer to get what we have here, but what we have here, for what it is way more advanced than like what we thought it would be. It was like we were thinking. I'm embarrassed to show the pictures of what we originally had for the. We thought.
I just want to remind everyone. This is what we've had before.
Wait, what's that? I'll say again, Cal.
I just want to remind everyone of what we had 2 years ago. I sent a link on Discord.
There's videos out there, and we were so proud. We were like, yeah, this is sexy, man. But it just makes me realize that if we can do this for a living, like the stuff that we'll be able to do, I'm more confident now than ever before that we can live up to our aspirations. When we first started, it was like, to me, it was like this exercise where it's like, well, you know what, we'll learn stuff in the process. Maybe I'll use it to get a job or something, and and we'll have fun along the way. But based on where we've gotten, just even right now, like I'm confident we can make something really awesome. Which maybe that should lead us to the next conversation about where we're going, because I know that both Cal and I are very, very devoted. This is really has always been our dream to create something like this, and it's the thing that makes me excited to be alive, to be able to. It's an excuse to learn all kinds of incredible things, and to kind of to use every part of myself that I like the most, creativity and programming and mathematics and everything. Put it all and literature and stuff. Put it all into one place and create a masterpiece. But we've also had a lot of conversations about how to chart a course to a future where we get to a point where we can do this full time. Because we both have to make a living. And in my situation, I have a family to support and a kid who has health issues, and so, if I were single or even married without kids, like it would be really easy to like quit my job, live in a trailer somewhere, and then just like live off my savings and do this full time. But it's it's impossible to justify that kind of time when when you have a lot of obligations. And so it's still something we very much both love to work on, and it's very fulfilling for me to work on. I don't see myself quitting or having any reason to quit anytime soon, because even if there were no patrons whatsoever, it would still be a really fun thing to work on. It's great engaging with the community, and I've learned so much from everyone, and the things they have the insights that they have. And so it's definitely something that'll continue into the future. But it's a little tricky because me personally, I'm fairly financially solid at this point with my job and my wife's job, and my family's doing good. And I'm pretty happy with kind of the timeline I've set for songs and the progress that we're making. But for Calandial, it's a little different, and it's been on my mind a lot on how to get Calandial in a position where at least we can get one person doing this full time and living comfortably, right? And so, kind of my near-term goal is to try to. Right now, all the Patreon money is going to Cal, who's spending the most time on the project by far, and so it'd be nice. My immediate goal in the future is just to get to a point where Cal can live a comfortable life and work on this full time and not have to, and have someplace decent to live, and etc. So this is a professional project. For me, it's a little trickier because I don't see a path anytime immediately where I can make this my full-time job within 3 years or anything like that, unless we get some weird grant or something, someone drops a lot of money on us, or for some reason Songs goes viral and there's a whole bunch of contributors. It's hard to see a situation where I can devote my full life to this, One thing I was contemplating doing was, is basically saving for a number of years, putting a bunch of money into an index fund, so I've got like $500,000 sitting around, and then just quitting my job and then just being able to work on songs full time without being accountable to anybody, right? Don't have to worry about some company above us who invested in us, who's demanding, that we put in a bunch of features we don't want. We don't have to worry about money running out anytime soon and having to compromise things in order to make money off of it. Like, I really want a situation where we can make exactly the game that we want, and not be under any kind of pressure to make it mediocre, And so that's one of the ways into the future that I see this going is, a couple years down the line for me, having a whole lot of money put away, and then being able to just quit and work on it full time. But otherwise, it's kind of would have to kind of continue at this pace. It'll get better. I'll get more time as time goes on. Once COVID is over, once my kids are back in school, things, a lot more time opens up. But it's still not, a full-time gig where I'm spending 40 to 50 hours on it a week, which I would really like to do because it's really challenging. But that's my monologue. Speechifying over. Anyone have any questions about the direction of songs?
Well, if I can offer any consolation or support, I won't be going anywhere anytime soon. In 2006, I was playing Civilization 4 when I was a kid, and I was dreaming of my perfect video game, exactly what I wanted to play, and it was basically this. And so you're making something that I find just perfectly suited to me, and so I will keep throwing shekels at you for as long as you're around.
Okay, thanks.
Come in on that. I'm also donating my shekels here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, and we're not too far off from, I think, making Cal financially self-sufficient to basically be able to be supported by. Assuming you don't want to move out of Poland. But what do you think, Cal?
Sorry?
What do you think? I've been talking a lot for you, but I should let you speak for yourself.
I'm in Poland right now, so I guess you get 4 times the bang for your buck.
Right. That's one thing to consider. Like, for me, like in the United States, with the work that I do and stuff like that, and the cost of living here, like, it takes a lot more patron dollars to support me than it does Cal, And so, if we get to something like, $2,000 a month in the Patreon, like, that's enough for Calandiel to live like a middle class life in Poland, pretty much, and get out of the small town that you're in, and maybe, right. I've contemplated just kind of taking some of my own money and making up the difference, just so songs. It would be like an investment in songs, right? In investing in you, and that could, that was another thought in the future, just so that songs is like unambiguously a full-time project with at least one person who's on it full-time.
Right.
That would be a worthwhile investment, I think. Yeah, and there's a whole other subject about monetization long term. I mean, we could almost have a high council meeting about it, right?
Yeah, we talked about it a few days ago, later too.
Yeah, and there's a lot of options, and it's so tricky because, not everyone is super understanding, like the people that are in here, who have been very generous, and like when you try to pursue a monetization strategy, you have to consider like how people will perceive it, And of course, some monetization strategies are immoral and terrible and create perverse consequences in the game, like pay to win. It's like I remember I was really excited. I used to love the Ultima series, the RPG series way back when. And they made like a new one recently, and like their monetization strategy is you would find like some loot, you'd find a chest, and then you'd open it up, and if you hadn't like bought the premium game, then like you'd open up the chest and like a video would pop up, and it'd be like, watch this ad, and you can, and then you'll be able to see what the loot is. It was like the worst thing ever. It's like, no, we're not ever going to do that. No, that's never going to be our
but you are going to introduce gacha mechanics, right?
Some what mechanics?
gacha mechanics, right?
Well, there is.
It's a hot new fad. Everything like a 0.1% drop and just let people spend tens of thousands.
Oh, right, yeah. Or you can buy a bunch of loot boxes and then get it for free. Yeah, I mean that's No way, no pay to win, no pay to win. But we're looking at other things like like DLCs, like for races or things like that. And DLC like rubs some people the wrong way. It's like, why don't you just give me the whole game? And it's like, from someone who's not in the business of it, it can kind of seem to make sense. But when you're trying to figure out how do we continue to develop a game reliably for 10 to 20 years and continue to make great content, how do we sort of make sure that our revenue stream is reliable and we always have something that we can be selling and supporting the company with? And that's way more complicated for a game like Songs than a game like most others, where it's like, all right, they spent 2 years working on the game, they finished it, and then they sold it, and then they moved on to the next game. You kind of, it gets a bit more complicated, right? For something like this.
I guess, I don't know, we should probably not turn this into a monetization discussion, but I'm a huge fan of the early id Software model, where they'd like have a piece of the game for free and then the rest of the game would be paid for.
Right.
So something like, the first, I'm making stuff up, like something like the first 1,000 years. I don't know what the timeline, what the time frames of this project are going to be, like, of the game itself, but something like the first 500,000 years are for free or something like that. Maybe
yeah. Well, Path of Exile has, and I talk about Path of Exile all the time because they're an amazing company that have done amazing things based on where they started. Path of Exile, they know that they're a very niche game that some people are going to be fanatical about, right? That are really going to love it, right? And so their strategy is like, all right, we're just going to give you the game for free, and we're going to assume that you're going to spend a lot of time with this game and be really into it, and we'll love customizing your characters and stuff like that. So we're just going to sell you stuff like skins and cool spell effects and extra bank tabs and stuff like that. And they've made a lot of money with that approach, because my wife and I, we both played the game, and because we loved action RPGs that were really in depth, we were like, yeah, sure, we're willing to support the company and buy some cool spell effects and stuff like that. We spent way more money on that game than we ever did on like Diablo. We spent like $300 or $400 on Path of Exile just buying bullshit, but it worked, right? So there's a lot of different approaches, and yeah, not to steal all of the points for a future meeting, but yeah, there's options out there, and hopefully sooner than later we'll be implementing some of them when we get to a point where we have something we can reasonably sell. So anyone have any other questions about the direction of sort of the business angle, the lifestyle aspect, or just what it's like to be developing a game like this and balancing a busy life? Any questions at all?
What has your work-life balance been? I've told you, I think already, I haven't been following the development at all. So as far as I know, you're like working a regular full-time job and also doing this in your free time.
Yeah, so originally I was a marine biologist, and I had no programming experience. I probably never would have none of this would have gotten off the ground without Calandial, really, because Calandial had a lot of the more bona fide computer science chops and stuff like that. So yeah, I was, raising 2 babies, working, I had my own business with my brother, working with fish tanks, and I was just programming in my free time, and to be honest, for about 5 years of doing that with just I played practically no video games, no recreational activities, because I just couldn't fit it all in my life, but I wanted to do it, because this has been a dream my whole life. But it kind of was burned me out after about 5 years, and my kids are getting older, and I wasn't able to spend as much time with them, and so it felt like that breakneck speed just was not something I could or would be willing to do indefinitely, right? And then I got a new job in IT, which ended up being infinitely better in every way, but way better pay, way better work-life balance. And so for the past year, basically, I've been juggling the kids who are home from school is my eldest daughter has lung issues, and so she has to be isolated. And I've been working remote with my IT job, and then working on songs whenever I have the opportunity. And it feels just way more sustainable than it was before, right? And once the kids go back to school, then I'm going to have even more time to be able to devote toward this. Right now, in the past year, I've had to focus on little things, like the new map mode here, the color map mode, and things like soil moisture. Like, I haven't made any new big systems just because it takes like so much mental energy to work on it, and to be able to focus on it. It's funny because when I got into a real IT job, I thought it was going to be like way harder than songs. It was complete opposite. Songs of the Aeons is way more complicated than any of the stuff I work on in like my IT job. And so it's like, which is kind of cool, which makes it even more kind of gratifying, but it also just means that like it takes a lot more out of you, and like, you know, when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of lines of code, you have to know where everything is. You have to be sort of have this familiarity with the territory. Otherwise, you change something and you forget what its downstream effects are, and you blow up entire systems. And it's like, that's why I haven't made any new systems, any major new systems since COVID hit. Just I couldn't focus on it explicitly enough, so just was tuning up. Go ahead.
I guess now we know why nobody has made this game before.
No, exactly. Yeah, I mean, basically, it's like, and I mean, I think Calandial and I are lucky to have found each other, because I think we both bring something to the table that is not very common.
It's actually a bit of a funny story, because we're making basically very similar games for like 3 months, and then someone on my subreddit told me about songs, and we decided to merge the projects, kind of.
Yeah, and
so pure serendipity.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I was very lucky. And I mean, you know, like, there was another person that was sort of part of the project, David, who worked with us for a while, but I think got burned out by it. But kind of proved too that like finding the right people is not, you can't just get anyone to partner with you on a project like this. Like, they need the right work ethic, they need the right mentality, they need the right unique way of seeing things, and we both bring to the table. I mean, I can't do any of the stuff that Cal does, like, so it's very lucky to have met. And one of the reasons I don't want to let Songs of the Aeons go, because once I let Cal go, then I'm losing a resource, and that I'm not gonna get back. You know, it's funny because right now in my company there's like hundreds and hundreds of IT people, and I definitely haven't met anyone yet that's like Calandial. So you find a good thing, you gotta hold on to it.
That Polish exceptionalism.
Yeah. So, yeah, dreams. You know, songs. God, it's like this game. It sounds cheesy, but this project is like infused itself in every part of my life. Like, I can't go anywhere or do anything without kind of thinking about it or relating it to the real world. You know, I'll just be going on a walk through the woods or something and kind of be thinking about, the soil profile of the area, or why the trees are growing the way they are, or why there's, scrubland in a particular area. And I'll take it back to songs, and kind of, it inspires, everything I do in life kind of inspires new things with Songs of the Aeons. And it's probably every 15 minutes or so there's something I take with me back to the project. So it's a lifestyle for sure.
You're definitely making something unique, you two. It's just an amazing game. So
thanks. It's really encouraging.
I mean, sort of. If you're looking at games recently, they've been moving away from simulations rather than towards them. They've been trying to make cinematics, and I mean cinema actually. Just a movie. You kind of
opposite.
Right?
Walking simulators, right?
Yeah, stuff like that. Whereas this has so much more potential. Like, this is the future, really.
Well, the thing is, like, you can't. The weird thing is this project, like, you can't. There's no template for it. You can't just copy it, and that's the crazy thing about it. And one of the reasons I don't worry too much about someone stealing it and then like making it better and monetize, because it's like it's just so complex. Like, a certain amount of your soul has to like go into it, and it's just and that's why I don't think you see games like this made very often, because it's really easy to look at Civilization or World of Warcraft and make a clone out of it and then tweak a few mechanics and say, oh look, it's a new game. Like that's easy, or to make one of those, what are they called, like on your phone, right, where you have a game where you click a button and then you wait 20 minutes and then you made a lumber yard, which then gives you more lumber that you can use to make this other thing when you click.
I think it's called like an idle game, I think.
Yeah. And those games are easy to make, right? Because you just copy somebody else, but you can't really. We're not copying anyone with songs, really. We're just kind of making what is in our head, the way that we want to do it.
Yeah, for the record, SotE is 250,000 of lines of code big, which is eight times bigger than original Doom.
Yeah.
But you already have 250k lines. That's nice.
Yeah. it's involved. So yeah,
it's unique in just the way that as a project you don't even have gameplay, and this is already a super useful tool if you want to create a world that's somewhat realistic, rather than just spending fucking hours of time. You can just pop in the SotE, go and have a coffee, and come back to something that's, relatively accurate.
If you're thinking about monetizing this, how about advertising this towards like dungeon masters and stuff like that, where hey, we're gonna make you a world real quick. Just pay us like half a dollar or something, a token amount, and we'll make you a world.
Yeah, I wonder to what extent it would be nice to and that's an important question. Like, well, do we want to try and make some money off this by, say, instead of creating dynamic civilizations immediately, just procedurally generate societies and stick cities and stuff around, so that then, dungeon masters can have like a world to play in that isn't just like geography, right? I mean, that may be a worthwhile detour, right? If we wanted to try and monetize, and then once we have that, then we have sort of a backdrop where we're making some money, and then we can start making the gameplay mechanics, right? That's a possibility.
It's an interesting idea, but I feel like it might be better if the game were closer to a finished state before we go advertising it to people. So I feel like people are kind of weary of like early access type stuff, like where there's just too many times where you like see something that looks really cool and exciting and you buy it in early access and then they just never finish it or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's why we've
Especially
kind of
a 4X early access.
But that's also why we've been very, like, we've said what we want to do, right, in our aspirations, but we haven't, we've been very forward about the time frame that we expect the development to be, how long we expect to be working on this, and we're always equivocating and stuff like that. But I think when it comes to just creating like a tool for like dungeon masters, that's something that you could whip into a finished product state way faster than you could whip a 4X into, So like if the DM tool, you might not even cause time to move, It's just like, here's your world, here's all the geopolitical states and everything, and a couple things about them, and that would have been something that could have been super useful when I was DMing, and also it would be, to my knowledge right now, there is no tool out there. There's tools where you can make worlds and stuff like that, but they're almost never like geographically accurate, geologically accurate, stuff like that.
Yeah, they're like map making tools. They're not really simulations like this one.
Right.
Yeah, they usually use spelling noise to generate terrain because it's fast. It's easy.
Right, and then you can kind of like, then you can kind of go in and edit things or whatever, but it's not. To my knowledge, this is, I could be wrong, but like, I've looked around, we're pretty much the only ones doing this to this scale, right? And so we have that angle, we have that niche kind of locked up at the moment for the most part. All right, well, do we have any, I think we're coming on 2 hours now, so is there anything else anyone would like to say? Any other questions before we start to pack this in?
Solitarian?
I mean, I still have some questions, but I think 2 hours is probably enough. I could go on for another hour if I wanted to.
That's what the Discord channel is for. What about typical name? You got anything?
Not in particular. One thing I noticed, like with regards to terrain, I noticed there doesn't seem to be as much with regards to the water as there is the land. Like, is there like stuff like going on underwater, or is it just like water for now?
We have the geology of the water sort of sorted out, right? I mean, ideally, long term, what we want to have is civilizations. So fisheries is a big thing. Even if you don't have water civilizations, you have fisheries, which are extremely important to coastal communities as a source of protein. And like we were talking about before, like fisheries are kind of like the kind of subsidy that's necessary to support a society in an area. And you can have places like limestone islands that are garbage, but you can have a robust fishery that can sustain a civilization here, right? And so that's something that we definitely want to be able to. That's definitely planned, right? And I mean, I'm a marine biologist too, so it'd be a crime if I didn't simulate that stuff.
I was just thinking, like, historically in the Mediterranean, there was the invasion of the Sea Peoples at some point during the Bronze Age. And obviously those people were merfolk, because who else could see something like that that covers the Bronze Age.
Right, yeah. That's true. I mean, yeah, so... Yeah, merfolk are obviously the very first marine race that we want, and we want them to have interactions with coastal peoples. And they would generally exist on the continental shelf or around atolls and islands and things like that. But they wouldn't likely be deep sea people, right? But then we could also, in theory, have, either sea monsters that that come out of the deep every once in a while and terrorize the coast, or which are living in trenches, or special resources, that merfolk can kind of swim down and grab and stuff like that. And then races, too, that might exist purely around oceanic events like these here on seamounts, where you have a volcano down there producing heat, producing, chemosynthetic, consuming...
That is.
Right. So, yeah, there's a lot of possibilities there. Or crab people.
Also, like the watercolor is like reflective of the heat in the water.
Oh, say again?
So like the color on the water is reflective of the heat in the water. I thought it was like the depth or something.
It is the depth, but the reason these guys exist here is there's volcanism, right?
Oh.
So you have volcanoes. These are
everything.
these are the volcanoes that have penetrated the surface. These are all the volcanoes that either had penetrated the surface previously or are new volcanoes. And then a lot of this stuff is just this other stuff is just a sort of crustal distortion like you see in the real world, right?
Man, if you have like some kind of sea terror threat that appears every once in a while, you could actually have civilizations countering it, trying to like make a kind of defense force with something banding together to defeat it. I mean.
Summon your own kraken, or throw a sufficient number of virgins so that it'll go attack your neighbor and not you.
yeah. Oh my god, that's definitely this game works best if it's done as a simulation and not in a kind of gamey way, where it's this is an event that happens. Press OK or press cancel. I don't know.
Well, exactly, because the logic. So let's say like, where was our it from the pit? So you could imagine like. You could have a sea monster living down in this pit, some sea worm or something like that, right? And rather than make it like, so we rolled a bunch of dice and it popped up somewhere in the world, instead, like, you would have a thing living down there. It would be making decisions. It would have, a life bar. It would have a nutrient bar. Its nutrient bar goes down low enough, so it's like, need to eat. So it comes up and it evaluates its surroundings. And to you, on the surface, living in this little mountain valley here with your fishing community and farming community, to you, it's like an event, right? But it arises because there's something actually living down there doing stuff, And so it starts eating your commerce or eating your fishing boats. And yeah, I mean, that's really the root of what we want Songs of the Aeons to be, right? Same way you can have, your harpies up in the mountains or whatever who are exerting an influence on, living between this glacier or something. Right?
You could advertise this game to fetishists if you just make them,
No, don't say it. Don't say it.
I don't know if that would work.
No sexy harpies. No sexy. Well, for a DLC, maybe you can play a sexy harpies.
How much are we like showing on it? Because I was under the impression that it was mostly like you're looking at a map and like spreadsheets and stuff.
Hey, sexy spreadsheets.
Sexy.
I feel like to appeal to the fetishists, you need like pictures.
Yeah, well, you know, diplomacy screen pops open and there's a sexy harpy girl saying,
"Oh, okay."
Hello.
Yeah. We can definitely do that.
It depends on how much money is in it, right? This is all about selling it.
Okay. Right. I don't know if like we would do that, but like maybe a modder or something would eventually do that.
Yeah, we would never do that. Never ever.
Yeah. Oh, I haven't checked people are saying stuff in Twitch. Let's see. Octopus people. We're gonna have to have octopus people, obviously. Octopus are some of the most amazing animals. We need manna shrimp people. We need ottermen too, because we have to have, the Ottoman Empire.
I know some your little pop-up there said that something was the abyssal plains. Where's that?
Oh, the abyssal plains? That's way out deep in the ocean.
Oh, okay, underwater. Okay, I like that kind of abyss. Okay.
And then trench is just like fucking black. Like you can't see anything down there, so yeah, we just make it black.
When I heard abyss, I was thinking like the abyss.
Oh, you were thinking
because I couldn't find a picture.
You couldn't, but it's perfectly thematic. I mean, it looks the same as the abyssal plains, pretty much. I can't see anything.
I wasn't that tight passwords.
All right, so tropical saltwater lake. All right, well, I guess that should pretty much wrap it up. It's 12:51 now. I always am nervous about having these meetings, and I'm always sad that they end because they're so much fun. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And we'll continue to try to engage people in Discord and try to get the subreddit rolling again. But oftentimes, we have to, in a situation like what we're in, we have to make a decision between like what we spend our time on, and we prefer to spend as much time as possible on developing and not marketing and engagement. So we'll mostly be on Discord and occasionally be streaming as well. And I'll probably put this video up on the subreddit too. So thank you everyone for coming, and I'll see you all soon, hopefully. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thank you for your money, bitches. Money pigs.
You're welcome.
All right, see ya.
All right.